The evening in the Belgian countryside often carried a rhythm of its own, a rhythm unhurried by the frantic pace of city life. The rolling fields, dotted with quiet farmhouses, lay under the vast canvas of the night sky. Crickets chirped faintly from the hedgerows, and the occasional dog barked in the distance before silence reclaimed the moment. For most villagers, life was simple in those late 1980s winters. Family dinners, the warmth of a fireplace, and the comfort of knowing that the night would pass uneventfully, as it always had. The streets emptied early, and the only glow came from dim street lamps and the golden flicker of windows where curtains had not yet been drawn. It was in this calm atmosphere, this peaceful lull between one day and the next, that something began to disturb the ordinary rhythm. People at first noticed only small things, an unusual brightness against the dark horizon, a light that seemed too steady and too deliberate to belong to a passing plane. A farmer stepping outside to check on his livestock would pause, squinting upward. A police officer, driving the quiet roads that threaded through rural villages, slowed his patrol car to watch a cluster of lights moving silently above the treetops. They were not fast, not like aircraft, one might expect. Instead, they drifted slowly, deliberately, as if surveying the ground below. Many described them as forming the outline of a triangle, with a brilliant light at each corner and a softer glow at the center, hovering against the stillness of the sky. There was no roar of engines, no tremble in the air as helicopters or jets would bring. Instead, there was silence, an uncanny quiet that seemed to magnify the soft natural sounds of the night. Witnesses often remarked that they could hear their own breathing, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes, or the whisper of the wind in the trees far more clearly, simply because the objects themselves made no sound at all. In that silence lay the heart of the mystery. A large object, or perhaps more than one, moved with complete control yet betrayed none of the expected signs of human technology. Some villagers dismissed it at first as nothing more than tricks of the eye. The night sky, after all, is filled with strange illusions, and in rural areas one grows used to mistaking Venus for a hovering light, or confusing a passing aircraft for something unusual. Yet the reports multiplied, and the descriptions bore remarkable similarities. The size was often compared to that of a football field, immense and intimidating in scale, gliding at an altitude so low it seemed impossible not to be noticed. Those who witnessed it firsthand found themselves struggling to balance the wonder of what they saw with the comfort of ordinary explanations. Was it a secret military craft, a misidentified blimp, or was it something else entirely, something outside the boundaries of what they had been taught to expect in their quiet lives? The first stories trickled slowly into local police stations. Officers wrote them down, almost reluctantly, unsure how to classify them. The official reports described calm, sober witnesses, people who were not prone to exaggeration, who had no reason to invent a story. An officer who had spent years patrolling the same routes suddenly found himself questioning his own senses, recalling the image of a dark triangular silhouette blotting out the stars as it drifted across his path. Families would step outside together, pointing upward in hushed voices, their children whispering questions their parents could not answer. The sightings seemed to appear suddenly and without pattern. A village here, a stretch of road there, each report linked by the same eerie calm. The mystery was not in flashes of drama or shocking encounters, but in the subtle disruption of normal life. These were not isolated moments of panic, but collective experiences, quietly shared by entire communities. The black triangles did not roar into existence. They simply arrived, still, deliberate, and undeniably present. The sense of wonder mingled with unease, as if the night had opened to reveal something both magnificent and unsettling. Even those who did not witness the objects firsthand felt the ripple effect of the stories. Neighbors spoke softly about them over garden fences, newspapers carried whispers of unexplained lights, and local broadcasters made cautious references to unusual aerial phenomena. What began as a single sighting on a quiet night was becoming the seed of something larger, a wave of reports that would soon capture the imagination of a nation. For the people who stood under those skies, the memory of that first sighting did not fade quickly. They recalled the way the lights moved with steady precision, how the triangular form seemed to defy the logic of ordinary aircraft, and above all, how the silence pressed down heavier than the sight itself. That silence was not just the absence of sound, it was the presence of mystery. It was the beginning of what would come to be known as the Belgian UFO Wave, and though no one knew it yet, it was the start of one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of modern sightings. To truly understand why the sightings over Belgium left such a deep mark, we must step back into the late 1980s. A period when the world itself seemed suspended between tension and transition. Belgium, though a relatively small nation, carried a weight far larger than its size would suggest. Nestled at the crossroads of Western Europe, it was both a cultural mosaic and a strategic fulcrum. Its skies were not just the domain of farmers gazing upward from their fields. They were layered with meaning, patrolled and monitored, watched closely by military forces that knew the importance of every radar signal. This was no isolated corner of the world. Belgium sat at the very heart of NATO's European command, its cities and air bases woven into the larger fabric of Cold War vigilance. The Cold War was nearing its end, though at the time few knew just how close the curtain was to falling. The Berlin Wall still stood tall until the last months of 1989, casting its shadow across Europe. The Soviet Union remained a powerful, if faltering, adversary, and NATO countries, Belgium among them, were watchful. This context mattered. Any unidentified object in Belgian skies carried implications that stretched far beyond the curiosity of villagers or the fascination of amateur skywatchers. An unknown craft could be misinterpreted as espionage, a test of boundaries, or even the beginning of an incursion. The weight of geopolitics pressed on every unexplained light, magnifying its importance far beyond its physical presence in the night sky. Yet Belgium was not only a military hub, it was also a cultural crossroads. French, Dutch, and German influences blended across its borders, and with them differing cultural attitudes toward mystery and the unexplained. Unlike the United States, where UFO culture had long been wrapped in tales of Roswell and cinematic portrayals, Belgium's public discourse was more measured, more cautious. Here, UFOs were not the stuff of pulp magazines or Hollywood thrillers, but quiet curiosities occasionally mentioned in small news columns or late-night radio shows. Most Belgians were pragmatic, skeptical, and grounded. Their lives revolved around work, family, and community. This made what happened in 1989, and the years that followed, all the more striking. When ordinary citizens, police officers, and even military officials began reporting black triangles in the sky, the cultural foundation of disbelief was shaken. Technological change added another layer. The late 1980s and early 1990s were years of rapid development in aviation and aerospace. Stealth technology had entered the global imagination, with aircraft like the American F-117 Nighthawk being revealed after years of secrecy. Rumors of exotic designs, hidden projects, and secret test flights circulated throughout Europe. The idea of human-made craft, capable of defying traditional expectations, was not entirely far-fetched, and many Belgians wondered whether the strange triangles might be a glimpse into military technology not yet revealed to the public. At the same time, however, Belgium's location, crowded airspace bordered by multiple nations, made such clandestine flights unlikely, or at least highly risky. Why, many asked, would experimental aircraft from another nation be tested over densely populated European villages, where discovery was nearly certain? The questions only deepened the mystery. Daily life in Belgium moved at its usual pace. Cobblestone streets busy with markets, children biking along canals, city cafes filled with conversation. Yet the geopolitical weight of the era was never far away. Brussels, home to NATO headquarters, and the European Economic Community, pulsed as a center of diplomacy and defense. Air defense systems tracked movements across the skies, radar operators trained their eyes on monitors, and military planners constantly prepared for possibilities that might never come. In this environment, the sudden appearance of silent triangular craft was not simply an oddity. It was a puzzle with both local and global stakes. The psychology of the time also played a role. The Cold War had fostered decades of vigilance, of looking outward with suspicion, and inward with quiet tension. Communities were accustomed to living under the shadow of global rivalry, even if it was felt more subtly than dramatically. Against this backdrop, the UFO wave struck a strange chord. The sightings were unsettling, yes, but they were not perceived in the same way as potential Soviet incursions or threats of nuclear escalation. Instead, they were curiously calm events, silent, slow-moving and oddly peaceful. This contrast between geopolitical anxiety and the tranquil nature of the sightings created a sense of surreal unease. It was as if something unknown had stepped into the heavily monitored airspace of Europe, not with aggression, but with quiet confidence. The Belgian press of the time reflected this atmosphere. Journalists, while cautious, noted the growing wave of reports. Unlike the United States, where UFO stories often veered into sensationalism, Belgian coverage was restrained, analytical, even respectful. This gave the public permission to treat the sightings seriously, rather than dismissing them outright. Skepticism remained, but it was balanced by a willingness to consider possibilities. After all, if police officers and trained observers were among the witnesses, it became harder to laugh off the claims as simple misperception. The credibility of those first witnesses laid the groundwork for a broader acceptance that something unusual truly was happening in the skies. In retrospect, it is clear that the timing was significant. Had the sightings occurred a decade earlier, they might have been interpreted purely through the lens of Cold War paranoia. Had they occurred a decade later, in a more stable and digitally connected world, they might have been drowned in a flood of online speculation. But in the narrow window of the late 1980s and early 1990s, they struck a balance, emerging in a society, cautious but attentive, skeptical but curious, with just enough openness to entertain mystery, without immediately reducing it to fantasy. Belgium's position in the late Cold War era provided the perfect stage for the phenomenon to unfold. This stage setting is essential, because it explains why the black triangles were not merely lights in the sky, dismissed as aircraft or illusions. They appeared in a nation whose skies were among the most carefully observed in the world, at a time when every radar signal mattered. In a culture where skepticism was strong but respect for testimony even stronger, they emerged into a landscape where ordinary life continued serenely, yet under the surface, the weight of history and politics made every unexplained event resonate more deeply. It is within this environment, half pragmatic, half anxious, that the first true wave of sightings began to unfold. Villagers, police, and military officers alike would soon report objects so strange, so consistent in description, that disbelief became harder to maintain. The calm stage of Belgian life was about to be disrupted, and the quiet skies that had long comforted its people would soon carry one of the most enduring mysteries of modern times. The winter of 1989 drifted across Belgium, with its usual rhythm of short days and long nights. Families prepared for the holidays. The streets in small towns were lined with glowing decorations, and the countryside was wrapped in a hushed stillness. Yet, beneath this familiar routine, something extraordinary began to stir. On the evening of November 29th, a series of reports emerged that would mark the beginning of what became known as the Belgian UFO Wave. The witnesses were not dreamers or eccentrics. They were ordinary people. Police officers on duty, couples driving home, villagers enjoying the crisp air. Their descriptions carried a strange consistency, each one adding weight to the story that was quietly unfolding. That night, in the small town of Eupen near the German border, two police officers patrolling in their car noticed a bright light in the sky. At first, they assumed it must be a helicopter, but as they slowed and studied it more carefully, doubts crept in. The object hovered with an unnatural stillness, glowing steadily without the telltale noise or rotor movement of a helicopter. The officers pulled over, stepping into the cold night air, and observed it directly. They described it as a large, triangular craft, with bright lights at each corner, and a softer one at the center. It moved silently, gliding with deliberate precision, before drifting away toward the horizon. The officers, trained to observe and report with accuracy, recorded what they had seen without embellishment. Their calm, factual account would later become one of the earliest credible sightings in the wave. Elsewhere in the region, other witnesses began to call local authorities with similar descriptions. A family returning home from a late dinner saw a massive triangular silhouette crossing low above the treetops, so large it seemed to blot out the stars. They slowed their car to watch in silence, the children in the back seat whispering nervously. One of the adults later recalled that the most unsettling part of the encounter was not the size, nor even the lights, but the complete absence of sound. In a world where even distant airplanes could be heard long before they were seen, the quietness of the craft pressed heavily on their senses. Over the following weeks, the reports multiplied. Farmers, walking out at night to check their barns, saw the same glowing formations gliding silently above the fields. Villagers stood together, pointing skyward, as the triangular shapes hovered and shifted. Some spoke of the craft descending so low that they could see its underside clearly, a dark, solid mass with lights fixed at each point. Others described it following them along rural roads, maintaining a steady pace as though it were observing their movements. Each account echoed the last, creating a chorus of testimony too consistent to ignore. Psychologists, who later studied the wave, remarked on the unusual clarity of these accounts. In many UFO cases, details differ wildly between witnesses. Memories are shaped by imagination, expectation, or fear. But in Belgium, the stories aligned with uncanny precision. Witnesses described similar shapes, sizes, and behaviors. Many spoke of the same silence, the same triangular formation, the same impression of immense size. The consistency made the wave stand apart from countless other sightings that could be dismissed as confusion or exaggeration. It seemed that entire communities were observing the same phenomenon, each reinforcing the credibility of the others. In Eupen and the surrounding towns, the wave soon became more than whispers. Groups of people gathered outside on cold evenings, gazing upward in hopes of catching sight of the mysterious triangles. Local police were overwhelmed with calls, many from citizens who described the objects calmly, without fear or hysteria. This was not a case of panic spreading through a community. It was something subtler, a quiet, almost reverent awareness that something unknown was moving above them. The reports spanned age, occupation, and background. Children, grandparents, farmers, and city workers all found themselves united by the same surreal experience of watching dark, silent craft glide overhead. One particularly striking account came from a couple driving home late one night. They noticed a formation of lights moving low across the horizon and pulled over to the roadside. As the object approached, they realized it was not several lights moving together, but one enormous craft with lights fixed at its points. It passed directly above them, filling the sky. The couple later described how they instinctively lowered the volume of their car radio, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing, only the faint whisper of wind through the trees. For years afterward, they remembered not just the sight, but the uncanny feeling of stillness, as though time itself had slowed during those moments. Another witness, a police officer stationed in the region, reported seeing the craft hover for several minutes near a cluster of houses. He described it as steady and deliberate, maintaining position before slowly moving on. His testimony carried particular weight because of his training and the responsibility of his role. He had no reason to exaggerate, no personal gain in reporting something unbelievable. His words were matter of fact, carefully chosen, and later included in official records. As the weeks passed, the sighting spread. Reports came from across Belgium, each one echoing the same details: massive triangular craft, silent flight, steady lights at the corners. It was no longer confined to a single village or a handful of people. Entire regions seemed touched by the phenomenon. The Belgian press began to take notice, publishing cautious articles that repeated the descriptions without mockery. Television stations ran brief segments, interviewing witnesses who appeared calm, serious, and sincere. Far from fueling hysteria, the coverage lent credibility. The wave was no longer an isolated oddity. It was becoming a national conversation. The psychology of mass witness events is often complex. Skeptics argue that once a story is reported, others may unconsciously adopt similar details, shaping their memories to fit a narrative already in circulation. Yet in Belgium, many of the earliest reports came before widespread media coverage, and the testimonies matched long before people could have influenced one another. Investigators noted that the consistency seemed to stem not from collective imagination, but from the sheer fact that people were describing what they had truly seen. The calmness of the witnesses stood out most. These were not frightened people crafting stories from fear. They were grounded individuals, reporting something extraordinary in the same tone they might describe a traffic accident or a lost animal. By early 1990, the volume of reports had reached a level that demanded attention. Police logs filled with calls, sketches were drawn by witnesses, and local officials began forwarding accounts to higher authorities. The wave was no longer a quiet curiosity. It was a phenomenon too widespread and too credible to ignore. What had begun on a cold November night, in a small town near the German border, had expanded into one of the most remarkable UFO waves in modern history. As word spread, the Belgian people found themselves looking upward more often, scanning the skies during their nightly routines. Some did so with hope, eager to see the mysterious triangles with their own eyes. Others did so with unease, wondering what such objects could mean. The sightings had become a part of daily life, woven into conversations in cafes, whispered about on buses, and debated in living rooms. Yet for all the talk, no explanation was forthcoming. The black triangles continued their silent passage over Belgian skies, moving with deliberate calm, defying the expectations of all who watched them. The wave had begun, and with it came the realization that something extraordinary was unfolding across the nation. The credibility of eyewitnesses, the consistency of their accounts, and the sheer volume of reports placed Belgium at the center of one of the most puzzling mysteries of the modern era. The stage was set for deeper involvement, for investigation, and for the military itself to turn its gaze toward the skies. What began as quiet observations by villagers and police officers was about to escalate into a phenomenon that would draw in radar operators, fighter pilots, and international attention. The silent black triangles were no longer just a curiosity. They had become an undeniable presence in the lives of thousands. By the early months of 1990, what had begun as scattered reports across small Belgian towns had grown into a phenomenon impossible to ignore. Ordinary citizens had spoken, families had reported their sightings, and police officers had logged countless calls. Now, the weight of responsibility shifted to those who monitored the skies with precision instruments and advanced technology: the Belgian military. When a country's airspace is at the center of European defense, unexplained phenomena cannot simply be dismissed. What if they were foreign incursions? What if they were advanced aircraft slipping into NATO territory? These were not idle questions in a land where radar screens constantly swept the heavens. The Belgian Air Force had remained aware of the growing reports, but it was in late March of 1990 that they became directly entangled in the mystery. On the night of March 30th, into the early hours of March 31st, radar operators began to notice unusual returns. Civilian reports were already flooding in, people across the countryside phoning in to say that the triangles were once again gliding silently overhead. This convergence of civilian testimony and military observation created a moment of tension. The Air Force could no longer treat the matter as folklore. Something was in the skies, and it demanded a response. Two F-16 fighter jets were scrambled from Belgian Air Base, roaring into the night with the kind of speed and sound that contrasted sharply with the silence of the unidentified objects. Their mission was simple: intercept, identify, and record. The pilots had radar systems far more advanced than anything available to civilians, capable of locking onto targets at great distance. At first, success seemed promising. The F-16 systems acquired locks on the mysterious objects, confirming that something tangible, something solid, was moving through the skies. But just as suddenly as the locks were established, they broke. The targets seemed to vanish, not drifting away at ordinary speed, but accelerating so rapidly that radar systems could no longer track them. For the pilots, the experience was unsettling. They expected evasive maneuvers from enemy aircraft, but nothing like this. The objects moved in ways that defied their training, accelerating at extraordinary rates, changing altitude dramatically in seconds, and performing movements that would have torn a conventional aircraft apart. These maneuvers were not speculative, they were recorded by radar. The logs later showed sudden drops of thousands of feet in moments, shifts in direction that seemed physically impossible, and yet, to the naked eye, ground witnesses continued to describe the same thing they always had: massive silent triangles, drifting slowly, calmly, across the countryside. This contradiction between military instruments and civilian observation deepened the mystery. To the ground observers, the craft appeared leisurely, unhurried, almost graceful. To the pilots and radar operators, they appeared as blurs of motion, capable of near instantaneous acceleration. Some speculated that the objects might have possessed multiple modes of movement, shifting from slow glides to bursts of incredible speed. Others wondered if the radar readings were faulty, though technicians reviewed the data carefully and found no ordinary explanation. Importantly, the Belgian military did not dismiss the sightings outright. The Belgian Air Force took the reports seriously, compiling data and working with the National UFO Investigation Group, SOBAPS, Société Belge d'études des phénomènes spatiaux. This collaboration between military officials and civilian researchers was unusual in the history of UFO studies. Typically, governments sought to downplay such events, treating them as embarrassments or curiosities unworthy of serious attention. But in Belgium, the approach was different. There was a genuine openness, a willingness to admit that something unexplained was occurring. Official statements from the Belgian military were cautious, but striking. They acknowledged that trained observers had reported phenomena that could not be explained by existing knowledge. They emphasized that the objects were not identified as hostile, nor were they dismissed as errors. They were categorized instead as unexplained aerial phenomena, a phrase that both admitted ignorance and avoided sensationalism. For many in the public, this careful acknowledgement carried more weight than any bold claim. It meant that the mystery was not just in the minds of ordinary villagers, it was in the radar logs, the fighter jets, and the files of the Air Force. On the ground, meanwhile, more and more witnesses added their accounts. During the March 30th, 31 incident, entire groups of civilians observed the triangles. Some saw them hovering above rooftops, others saw them gliding silently over fields. Police patrols reported them again, their notes detailed and precise. For a brief moment in time, Belgium seemed to exist beneath two skies, one visible to the eye, calm and deliberate, and another visible on radar, frenetic and ungraspable. The two perspectives together painted a picture of something far beyond conventional technology. In the aftermath of the scramble, the Belgian military released a measured report, summarizing their findings. They admitted that the objects had been tracked, that radar locks had occurred, and that the maneuvers observed could not be explained by known aircraft. The report did not leap to conclusions. It did not say extraterrestrial, but it did leave the question open. For the Belgian public, this openness was profound. It was rare for a military body to admit not knowing. That uncertainty itself became part of the fascination. The involvement of the Air Force transformed the wave. What had been whispers of villagers and quiet reports of police officers now had the weight of official recognition. International media began to notice. Articles appeared not just in Belgian newspapers, but across Europe and beyond. For many it was the combination of eyewitness accounts, radar confirmation, and military engagement that made the Belgian UFO wave one of the most compelling cases in modern history. Skeptics, of course, raised their voices as well. Some argued that the radar returns were atmospheric anomalies, echoes misinterpreted by equipment. Others insisted that the triangles must have been advanced aircraft, perhaps American stealth technology, tested without informing the Belgian authorities. Yet these explanations struggled against the sheer volume of consistent testimony. How could so many ordinary citizens, spread across so many towns, describe the same shapes, the same silence, the same massive size? And why would secret aircraft perform maneuvers that seemed to defy even the known capabilities of stealth planes? The debate would rage for years, but in those first months of 1990, the focus was not on explanation, it was on experience. For the people of Belgium, the memory of the fighter jets scrambling into the night sky became as vivid as the triangles themselves. Villagers recalled standing outside, hearing the roar of engines racing overhead, knowing that their military was attempting to chase the mystery. Yet when the jets returned, the objects remained unexplained, as elusive as ever. The contrast was stark, the technological might of modern air forces, struggling against something that seemed to slip effortlessly beyond reach. In the calm of those nights, the triangles continued to appear. They did not crash, they did not attack, they did not vanish forever. They simply glided, watched, and then faded into the horizon, leaving behind questions that no radar system or jet fighter could answer. The involvement of the Belgian military did not close the case. Instead, it opened it wider, lifting it from local curiosity to international puzzle. The silence of the black triangles now carried with it the weight of official recognition. They were no longer just stories told between neighbors. They were phenomena documented by the very institutions charged with protecting the skies. For Belgium, and for the world beyond, this was the moment when the mystery deepened. It was not just what people thought they saw, it was what the instruments confirmed, what the jets failed to catch, and what the authorities could not explain. The wave, once rooted in quiet villages, had become a matter of state, of defense, and of history. And as the public listened to their military admit uncertainty, the fascination grew. For in that uncertainty lay the most powerful truth, that something was out there, moving silently above the fields and towns of Belgium, and no one, neither civilians nor generals, could say for certain what it was. As the wave of sightings continued through 1990, the stories of ordinary people became the heart of the mystery. Villagers, police officers, students, farmers, even local officials, all began to share their encounters with the great black triangles that moved silently across the Belgian skies. Each account was personal, unique in its details, yet bound by the same strange consistency. People described the same shape, the same lights, the same impossible quietness. The reports came not from dreamers or eccentrics, but from practical men and women who had little reason to embellish. In their voices, the phenomenon gained its most human weight. In the small towns of Wallonia, many families recalled gathering outside when word spread that the objects had returned. Parents would call their children, neighbors would knock on doors, and groups would stand in silence, looking upward together. The craft did not dart like meteors or glimmer faintly like satellites. They loomed, massive and deliberate, their triangular forms blotting out portions of the night sky. People remembered the eerie sensation of listening for sound and finding none. No engines, no rumble, no hum, just a deep quiet, as if the usual noises of the night were dampened by the presence above. For many, this silence was more unsettling than anything else. One police officer, patrolling with a colleague, described stopping their car in disbelief as a triangular craft hovered low above the road. Its lights glowed in a pattern that seemed purposeful, 3 bright points at the corners, and a larger central light beneath. The object moved slowly, almost lazily, yet with an undeniable precision. When the officers stepped out of their car, they realized how enormous it was, stretching across a space larger than the street itself. They stared for minutes, radios in hand, before the craft simply glided away, vanishing into the darkness without acceleration or sound. Their written report would later be studied as one of the most reliable of the entire wave. Farmers told of watching the triangles drift silently over their fields. Some described the light reflecting faintly off the surfaces, suggesting a metallic sheen, though the details were never sharp enough to confirm. Others recalled seeing animals respond, cows growing restless, dogs barking wildly, or horses stamping nervously in their stalls. The craft themselves did not display aggression, yet their presence seemed to ripple through the environment, unsettling both people and animals alike. In urban areas, the encounters were just as striking. Drivers on country roads often reported pulling to the side as a triangle passed overhead, its immense shape covering the road like a moving shadow. Couples walking home at night remembered freezing in place, unable to look away, as the silent object crossed above the rooftops. Students returning from late-night gatherings whispered excitedly as they spotted the unmistakable formation of lights in the sky. Each story spread quickly, carried by word of mouth, until it seemed as though nearly every Belgian had heard someone speak of the triangles. Perhaps most compelling were the accounts in which multiple witnesses independently described the same event. Entire groups of people, separated by distance but united by timing, would report the same object moving across the same stretch of sky. These converging testimonies made it difficult for skeptics to dismiss the sightings as illusions or imagination. When police officers, families and strangers all recorded nearly identical experiences on the same night, the credibility of the reports deepened. One remarkable testimony came from a family driving home late one evening. The parents, seated in the front, first noticed lights in the sky and assumed they were from a plane, but as the object drew closer, it became clear that the lights were fixed on the corners of a massive triangular body. The children in the back pressed their faces against the car windows, describing the object as a flying house because of its size. The family pulled over and watched in awe as the triangle hovered almost motionless above the tree line, its central light casting a pale glow downward. After several minutes, it tilted slightly and drifted silently out of sight. Each member of the family later gave their accounts separately, and their details matched with uncanny accuracy. Other accounts captured moments of sheer wonder. People often spoke not with fear, but with a strange sense of calm curiosity. The objects did not behave like threats. They did not chase, did not attack, did not cause destruction. Instead, they moved with a serenity that left many witnesses with the feeling that they themselves were being observed. Some even described the sensation of being watched from above, though no windows or markings were ever seen. This feeling lingered long after the objects had disappeared, as though the encounter had been as much psychological as visual. At times the objects appeared astonishingly low, as if deliberately making themselves visible. In one case, a man cycling home through a rural lane reported a triangle passing so close overhead that he could see the faint outline of its underside. He described panels, or sections, that seemed darker than the surrounding surface, though the exact details remained vague in the dim light. What struck him most was the way the object seemed to float, defying the rules of weight and lift. It was too large, too still, to remain in the air, without some visible means of propulsion, and yet, it did. The Belgian UFO wave became unique precisely because of these accounts. In most cases throughout history, sightings were fleeting, lights seen in the distance, shapes quickly vanishing before they could be studied. But in Belgium, the objects lingered. They hovered. They glided slowly enough for multiple people to watch them, describe them, and remember them vividly. This duration of observation is what made the testimonies so rich and compelling. Not all witnesses were eager to share their stories. Some worried about ridicule, about being dismissed as superstitious or foolish. Yet as more reports emerged, the stigma lessened. Newspapers began to print accounts, television stations aired interviews, and the stories entered public conversation. When even police officers and officials admitted to their experiences, the topic gained legitimacy. Ordinary people felt emboldened to speak, knowing they were not alone. The shared nature of these sightings created a rare cultural moment. Communities gathered not to debate, but to wonder. Conversations around dinner tables, in cafes, and at workplace breaks turned to the triangles in the sky. Unlike stories of monsters or apparitions, these accounts carried a sober clarity. People were not speaking of shadows or visions. They were speaking of objects, structured and deliberate, moving in the skies of a modern European nation. In the years that followed, these eyewitness accounts would be collected, catalogued, and studied in detail by both civilian researchers and military officials. The files grew thick with reports, each one a piece of the larger puzzle. Some were brief, others lengthy and descriptive, but together they painted a remarkably consistent picture. The Belgian UFO wave became not just a case of strange objects in the sky, but a case of collective human testimony, ordinary voices speaking of extraordinary nights. Even now, decades later, those who lived through those months often recall their experiences with clarity. The memory of standing in a field or on a roadside, staring upward as something vast and silent hovered above, never quite fades. For many, it was the most inexplicable moment of their lives, a story carried quietly but firmly into the present. And through these countless voices, calm, sincere, unwavering, the mystery of the Belgian UFO wave endures. When the wave of sightings could no longer be confined to whispers in villages or quiet conversations at cafes, the question inevitably shifted to the authorities. What did the government know? How would the military respond? And perhaps just as importantly, how would the press carry the story to a public already buzzing with fascination? In Belgium, the answer was remarkable, because instead of silence or ridicule, the official response was measured, transparent, and in its own way, deeply unusual. It began with local police, as reports mounted in late 1989 and throughout 1990. Many of the earliest witnesses were themselves law enforcement officers. They filed written statements, spoke to their superiors, and in some cases, coordinated calls from citizens who phoned in sightings. Unlike in other countries where officers might quietly dismiss such claims, Belgian police treated them with a seriousness that reflected their duty to public order. Logs were kept, maps were marked with the times and locations of reports, and when several officers experienced sightings themselves, it became impossible for their colleagues to simply laugh away the accounts. The military soon entered the conversation. Belgium's Air Force was responsible for monitoring national airspace, and when low-flying, unidentified craft were being reported with such frequency, it became an issue of national security. Radar stations were alerted. Pilots were briefed. The possibility of secret intrusions, whether from hostile nations or clandestine projects, had to be considered. The geopolitical context made this especially urgent. NATO headquarters was located in Brussels, and Belgium's skies were not simply national territory, but part of a shared Western defense perimeter. Any unknown presence raised the stakes far higher than a curiosity of lights. The most dramatic military engagement came on the night of March 30, 1990. When two Belgian F-16 fighters were scrambled to intercept a reported triangular craft. Radar stations had detected unusual returns, and multiple ground witnesses confirmed sightings at the same time. The jets pursued the target, locking on briefly, before the object performed maneuvers that stunned even seasoned pilots. The radar showed rapid changes in altitude and speed that exceeded the known capabilities of contemporary aircraft. In one moment, the object dropped thousands of feet almost instantly, then accelerated away faster than the F-16s could follow. The chase continued for over an hour, yet no visual confirmation was achieved by the pilots, only the radar locks. For the Belgian Air Force, this became one of the most puzzling cases in their history. What set Belgium apart from other nations was the openness of its response. Rather than burying the incident in classified files, the Belgian Air Force released information to the public. They acknowledged the scramble, the radar data, and the difficulty in explaining what had occurred. The chief of operations at the time, Colonel Wilfried de Brouwer, later spoke publicly about the events, explaining the procedures followed and the seriousness with which the reports had been treated. His willingness to share details gave the entire phenomenon an air of legitimacy. Here was a high-ranking officer, speaking calmly, admitting that something unexplained had entered Belgian airspace. The press seized upon this openness. Newspapers across Belgium published detailed reports, often accompanied by sketches made by eyewitnesses. The most famous of these came from a young man named Patrick, who sketched the triangular craft with lights at its corners. His drawing was reproduced widely, becoming the iconic image of the Belgian UFO wave. Unlike the sensational UFO stories that often appeared in American tabloids, Belgian reporting was careful and measured. Articles laid out the times, locations, and witness names, presenting the sightings almost as local news events rather than outlandish mysteries. This tone of respect encouraged readers to treat the subject with similar seriousness. Television followed suit. Interviews with police officers, military officials, and ordinary citizens gave the events a human face. Entire families appeared on screen, describing their shared experiences with calm sincerity. The sight of uniformed officers recounting their encounters left a deep impression on viewers. This was not hearsay or rumor. These were the voices of trusted public servants, speaking plainly about what they had seen. For many, this was the turning point, the moment when skepticism gave way to acceptance that something truly unusual was occurring. The government did not attempt to suppress discussion. In fact, officials seemed almost relieved to share responsibility with civilian investigators. The Belgian Society for the Study of Space Phenomena, known as SOBEPS, became a key partner in cataloging reports. This civilian research group collected thousands of testimonies, interviewed witnesses, and collaborated with military officials. It was an unprecedented partnership, with government and civilian researchers working side by side to investigate the phenomenon. Their cooperation produced detailed reports and later publications that remain some of the most comprehensive UFO documentation in history. Internationally, Belgium's transparency drew attention. Newspapers in neighboring countries carried stories of the wave, often contrasting it with their own government's secrecy. American researchers in particular were struck by the willingness of the Belgian Air Force to share radar data and official statements. For decades, UFO research in the United States had been hindered by official denials or dismissals. In Belgium, the openness created an entirely different atmosphere, one where the mystery was not ridiculed, but studied. Of course, not all reactions were serious. Some commentators joked about Belgian waffles and UFOs in international coverage, and skeptics suggested that the government was simply being cautious, careful not to dismiss reports, while also not endorsing them outright. Yet the very act of acknowledgement carried weight. By refusing to deny or ridicule, officials left space for genuine inquiry. This choice set the Belgian wave apart from almost every other major UFO event of the 20th century. The media's role was equally important in shaping public perception. By presenting the sightings with respect, they gave ordinary citizens confidence to share their stories. Each new article or television segment encouraged more witnesses to come forward. The phenomenon became part of daily life, not as a source of fear, but as a collective mystery. For months, the triangles dominated headlines, and conversations about them filled the cafes of Brussels and the markets of Liège. Perhaps most striking was the balance maintained between mystery and calm. The government never declared the objects extraterrestrial. The media never claimed invasion. Instead, both emphasized the unknown. Something unusual had appeared, it was being studied, and no immediate threat was detected. This balance allowed the Belgian people to remain intrigued without panic. The triangles became part of the cultural fabric of the time, a shared mystery that united communities across language, region, and class. Decades later, the Belgian government's response is still studied as a model of transparency. Colonel de Brouwer, and others involved, have spoken openly about the events in interviews and documentaries, maintaining that while no definitive explanation was reached, the sincerity of the witnesses and the quality of the data were undeniable. The partnership between government, media, and civilian researchers created an archive of information unmatched in its scope. In the end, the official and public response did not solve the mystery. The objects remained unexplained, their origin uncertain, their purpose unknown. But by treating the phenomenon with seriousness and respect, Belgium allowed the story to unfold in a way that honored the experiences of its people. The result was a national mystery that felt less like a secret and more like a shared chapter in history. And as the sightings continued into the early 1990s, attention began to shift toward deeper questions. What were these craft? Could they be advanced human technology, hidden in secrecy, or something beyond our understanding entirely? Theories would emerge, debated passionately by skeptics and believers alike, as Belgium became the stage for one of the most compelling UFO debates of the modern era. As the months turned into years, and the Belgian skies continued to host their silent triangles, speculation naturally grew. For every witness who stood in awe under the hovering lights, there were researchers, skeptics, journalists, and even casual onlookers who attempted to give meaning to the mystery. Explanations emerged from every direction: technological, psychological, extraterrestrial, and conspiratorial, each one reflecting not only the phenomenon itself, but the mindset of a society grappling with the unexplained. The first and perhaps most grounded theory suggested that the black triangles were advanced human technology. This explanation drew strength from timing. In the late 1980s, stealth technology had just entered the public imagination. The American F-117 Nighthawk, with its sharp angular design, had been revealed to the world after years of secrecy, and the even more exotic B-2 Spirit bomber was whispered about in military circles. The idea that other experimental craft, silent, triangular, and unconventional, might exist did not seem far-fetched. Some argued that Belgium's central location in NATO made it an ideal place to quietly test or display such technology, ensuring that radar operators and air defenses could record its performance under real-world conditions. Yet the practical issues with this theory were difficult to dismiss. Belgium's airspace was not an isolated test range. It was densely populated, heavily monitored, and politically sensitive. Flying secret American or NATO craft over towns and villages risked detection, accident, and international embarrassment. Why risk exposing classified projects in an environment where so many witnesses, civilians, police, military alike, could see and report them? Moreover, the extraordinary flight characteristics recorded on radar, including rapid changes in altitude and speed, seemed to exceed what was known even of advanced stealth planes. If the triangles were human technology, they were far beyond anything officially acknowledged. The psychological explanation followed close behind. Skeptics pointed out that collective sightings often carry the fingerprints of suggestion, expectation, and cultural influence. A handful of initial reports could, in theory, set the stage for mass perception. As newspapers and television spoke of black triangles, ordinary people gazing at distant lights might unconsciously shape what they saw to match the descriptions already circulating. This phenomenon, known as expectation bias, has been documented in other UFO waves. The Belgian case, skeptics argued, might be an unusually dramatic example of collective imagination fueled by media attention. But here again, the details created friction. Expectation bias might explain vague reports of lights in the sky, but it struggled to account for the calm, detailed testimonies of trained observers, police officers, radar operators, and military pilots. The objects described were not fleeting stars mistaken for craft. They were vast structured shapes, often seen at close range, sometimes for minutes at a time. Suggestion could not easily account for the silence of engines, the precise triangular geometry, or the way entire groups of unrelated witnesses described the same features independently. Then there was the extraterrestrial hypothesis, always present in UFO discourse, but in Belgium, it gained unusual traction. The sheer consistency of the reports, triangular shapes with lights at the corners, slow silent movements, sudden accelerations, led some to argue that the objects represented a type of craft not yet known to humanity. Unlike the more chaotic or fantastical accounts of flying saucers in other decades, the Belgian triangles seemed purposeful, coherent, and technological. To many, they carried the impression of observation rather than contact, as if the skies of Belgium had briefly become a theater of quiet surveillance from an intelligence beyond our own. This interpretation, while exciting, was also tempered by Belgium's cultural pragmatism. Most citizens, even those who saw the triangles themselves, were hesitant to leap directly to extraterrestrials. Instead, they spoke of something unknown, allowing room for wonder without committing to cosmic explanations. Still, the extraterrestrial theory remained in the background, a possibility never proven, never disproven, and for many, never forgotten. Alternative theories also emerged, some more speculative than others. A few researchers suggested atmospheric phenomena, perhaps complex reflections of lights on unusual layers of air. Others wondered whether experimental drones, little known at the time, might account for the sightings. Some even proposed secret collaborations between nations, with Belgium's skies serving as a hidden stage for multinational projects. Each theory carried fragments of plausibility, but none fit the whole. The silence, the scale, the radar data, the sheer number of consistent testimonies, all resisted simple reduction. The role of SOBEPS, the Civilian Research Group, was crucial in shaping these debates. By collecting thousands of reports and subjecting them to rigorous analysis, they ensured that speculation did not drift entirely into fantasy. Their publications included diagrams, maps, and timelines, each one meticulously cross-referenced. They argued that the consistency of the reports ruled out mass hysteria, and that the cooperation between civilians and the military elevated the case beyond ordinary folklore. For SOBEPS, the Belgian wave represented not proof of extraterrestrials, but undeniable evidence of a genuine phenomenon deserving further study. The skeptics, however, remained firm. They pointed to the possibility of misidentified helicopters, aircraft seen at unusual angles, or even flares. They highlighted the absence of physical evidence, no debris, no clear photographs that withstood scrutiny. The most famous photograph of the Belgian Triangle, widely published at the time, was later admitted to be a hoax by its creator. For skeptics, this confirmed their suspicion. People wanted to believe so badly that they embraced weak evidence, overlooking mundane explanations. And yet the hoax photograph did little to erase the weight of the eyewitness accounts, especially those of trained observers. For every false lead, there remained dozens of sober testimonies. Theories clashed, but the mystery endured, untouched at its core. In retrospect, the debate over explanations reveals as much about human psychology as it does about the phenomenon itself. People seek patterns, narratives, frameworks that allow the unknown to be grasped. For some, the triangles were cutting-edge machines from within our own species. For others, they were illusions shaped by culture. For still others, they were visitors from beyond, slipping silently across the night sky. Each explanation reflected not only the evidence, but the worldview of those who held it. As the 1990s unfolded, and the wave gradually subsided, no definitive answer emerged. The black triangles faded from the skies, leaving behind only the echoes of their presence in memory, testimony, and report. But the theories continued, debated in books, lectures, and conferences, long after the sightings themselves had passed. The Belgian UFO wave became less about the objects themselves, and more about the enduring question they posed: how do we as humans confront the unexplained? Do we anchor it to our technology, our psychology, our hopes, or our fears? Or do we leave space for the possibility that something truly other walked quietly across our skies? In that open space of questioning, the mystery of the black triangles lingers still, unsolved, unsettling, and quietly luminous, like the lights that once floated above Belgium's villages, stirring wonder in the hearts of those who looked up. When the black triangles drifted silently across the skies of Belgium, They left behind more than eyewitness accounts and radar logs. They imprinted themselves upon the culture of a nation, shaping conversations, influencing media, embedding the mystery into the collective memory of Europe. What had begun as scattered reports in small towns soon grew into a story that transcended borders, becoming part of Belgium's identity in the late 20th century. The legacy of these sightings endures not only in official files, but in the way ordinary people recall that era, when neighbors gathered outside to look upward, when journalists spoke in measured tones about the unexplained, and when even governments admitted, with unusual humility, that they did not have all the answers. In Belgium itself, the wave created a rare sense of unity. A nation divided by language and regional identity, Flemish and Walloon, Dutch and French, found itself sharing a common mystery. Whether in the cobblestone streets of Bruges, the industrial towns of Liège, or the farmlands of Flanders, people spoke of the triangles with the same vocabulary, the same mixture of awe and unease. The objects seemed to belong to no region and no class. Farmers and city dwellers, police officers and students, factory workers and teachers, each could point to the skies and say they had seen or heard of something inexplicable. For a brief time, the mystery dissolved social barriers, creating a collective story that crossed Belgium's cultural divides. The media played a crucial role in cementing this legacy. Unlike the tabloid frenzy often seen elsewhere, Belgian coverage was sober, consistent, and respectful. This created an environment where the phenomenon was not ridiculed, but contemplated. Families watched television reports together, newspapers published sketches alongside serious interviews, and talk shows invited researchers to discuss the events with an air of measured curiosity. The respectful tone gave the subject a weight that allowed it to enter Belgian culture, not as fringe speculation, but as a shared puzzle. Even today, when older citizens recall the wave, they speak less of panic and more of wonder, the sense that they were living through a chapter of history whose significance might only be understood in hindsight. Internationally, the Belgian UFO wave gave new energy to the broader conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena. Researchers in the United States, France, and Britain pointed to Belgium as a model of transparency. Conferences highlighted the cooperation between the Belgian Air Force and civilian researchers, emphasizing how unusual it was for a government to admit openly that something unknown had entered its skies. For UFO communities, long accustomed to secrecy and denial, Belgium became a beacon, a case where seriousness replaced stigma. In lectures and publications around the world, the phrase "the Belgian wave" became shorthand for credibility. The influence stretched into culture and art as well. Writers and filmmakers drew inspiration from the triangular craft, weaving them into stories that blurred the line between fact and fiction. The calm, hovering shapes found their way into novels, documentaries, and even the designs of fictional spacecraft in television and film. For many creators, the appeal of the Belgian triangles lay in their restraint. Unlike dramatic saucer landings or abduction tales, the triangles were quiet, minimal, and enigmatic. They hovered rather than attacked, observed rather than announced. This subtlety carried a haunting aesthetic that appealed to storytellers seeking mystery without spectacle. In Belgium itself, the cultural footprint was quieter but enduring. Decades later, exhibitions and local history projects have revisited the events, displaying witness sketches, press clippings, and interviews as artifacts of a national mystery. For those who lived through it, the wave is remembered with a kind of nostalgia, a time when ordinary life was briefly touched by something extraordinary, when night skies became theaters of wonder. For younger generations, it remains a story passed down, a reminder that their parents or grandparents once stood in fields, pointing upward at a silent triangle that should not have been there. Psychologically, the legacy runs deeper still. The wave altered the way many Belgians thought about authority, science, and the unknown. When the Air Force admitted that it did not have an explanation, it challenged the assumption that governments always hold hidden answers. When thousands of testimonies were recorded without mockery, It gave weight to the idea that ordinary voices could matter in shaping collective understanding. The legacy of the triangles was not only the mystery itself, but the way society responded, open, respectful, and cautious, yet unafraid to admit uncertainty. The cultural resonance also lingers in language. In conversations about unexplained events, Belgians often reference the black triangles as a touchstone, a reminder that even in the modern world, with radar systems and satellites, mysteries can still intrude upon daily life. The phrase "like the triangles" carries meaning in Belgian discourse, signifying not just UFOs, but the broader idea of encountering the inexplicable with calm attention. At the same time, the wave left behind a paradox. It became both a unifying national story and an unresolved question. For some, it is remembered as proof that humanity glimpsed something extraordinary, perhaps even otherworldly. For others, it is a reminder of how perception, psychology, and rumor can shape collective memory. This tension between belief and skepticism is itself part of the legacy, ensuring that the wave remains alive in discussion, never fully claimed by one interpretation. The impact rippled beyond Belgium. In neighboring France, long home to its own UFO investigations, the wave reinforced the importance of systematic study. In the United States, where UFO culture was often polarized between believers and debunkers, Belgium offered a third path: quiet acknowledgement without sensationalism. And in Britain, where secrecy around aerial phenomena persisted, researchers pointed to Belgium as evidence that openness did not cause panic, but rather respect. The Belgian example influenced how future debates about unidentified aerial phenomena were framed across Europe and beyond. Decades later, the legacy remains visible, not only in research circles, but in the quiet corners of Belgian culture. There are still cafes where older patrons recall the nights of 1989 and 1990, speaking softly about the triangles as if recalling a dream. There are still families who, when gathered for holidays, retell the story of the night they stood outside, watching lights move silently across the stars. The events have settled into cultural memory, not as trauma or fear, but as a haunting curiosity, something unresolved, something that slipped into ordinary life and then slipped away again. Perhaps this is the most profound legacy of all, the reminder that mystery is not always destructive, that it can be shared without fear, that it can become part of identity without demanding resolution. The Belgian wave remains a story told not only in research journals, but in living rooms, classrooms, and quiet conversations. It is history, folklore, and science all at once. And like the silent triangles themselves, the cultural legacy hovers, present but elusive, steady but unexplained, casting its subtle shadow across time, reminding those who remember that sometimes the greatest mysteries leave no answers, only enduring wonder. In the decades since the black triangles first appeared over Belgium, the mystery has not dissolved. It has transformed. What once lived as nightly sightings and immediate headlines has evolved into a subject of modern investigation, quiet scholarly debate, and renewed attention in light of global discussions about unidentified aerial phenomena. The Belgian wave may have peaked between 1989 and 1990, but its echoes continue to shape the way researchers, governments, and ordinary citizens think about the unknown. In many ways, the story of the triangles has become less about what was seen in those skies, and more about how we continue to seek meaning in them. In the years following the wave, Belgian researchers, particularly those within the civilian organization SOBEPS, remained committed to gathering and preserving data. Their archives, filled with eyewitness testimonies, police reports, radar logs, and sketches, became invaluable not only for historians of the UFO phenomenon, but also for psychologists and sociologists interested in how collective experiences take root. By the late 1990s, SOBEPS published detailed volumes analyzing the events, offering measured hypotheses that ranged from experimental aircraft to possible extraterrestrial visitation. What stood out was not just the content, but the method, a meticulous effort to document, categorize, and preserve without sensationalism. This approach helped ensure that the wave would never be dismissed as a fleeting curiosity, but rather remembered as a case worthy of continued study. At the same time, the Belgian Air Force maintained a cautious stance. While officials admitted openly that they had observed radar anomalies and had received numerous reports, they also emphasized the limits of their knowledge. They neither confirmed nor denied exotic explanations, but they did not retreat into secrecy either. This transparency, unusual compared to other countries, allowed for ongoing dialogue between military and civilian researchers. Modern investigations often point to this collaboration as a model for how governments could engage with unexplained phenomena, by acknowledging uncertainty rather than hiding it, and by inviting serious research rather than encouraging ridicule. In more recent years, the Belgian triangles have entered a broader global conversation, as governments, particularly in the United States, began releasing declassified reports on unidentified aerial phenomena. Researchers pointed back to Belgium as one of the most credible, well-documented cases in history. The black triangles became part of a larger puzzle, discussed alongside sightings by U.S. Navy pilots, mysterious radar returns, and videos that sparked international attention. For Belgian citizens who remembered standing in fields under the silent craft, this global acknowledgement was a quiet validation, an affirmation that their experiences had not been forgotten or dismissed. Modern debates about the triangles are diverse, often reflecting the changing landscape of technology and culture. Some researchers argue that the objects may have been advanced military craft, perhaps experimental stealth platforms tested in European airspace. They point to the triangular shape, the silent movement, and the powerful lights as features consistent with early stealth prototypes. Yet others question why such craft would be flown repeatedly over populated areas, where detection and publicity were inevitable. Still others argue that no known technology of that era, not even in classified programs, could have matched the low-speed hovering and silent acceleration described by witnesses. Psychologists have also entered the debate, exploring how memory, perception, and collective suggestion shape long-term understanding of the events. They note that while many testimonies were consistent, human memory is not static, and over time, stories can shift in subtle ways. Skeptics suggest that a combination of natural phenomena, misidentified aircraft, and social reinforcement could have produced the wave. Yet these psychological explanations, while useful, often fall short of addressing the sheer number of independent reports, the radar corroborations, and the involvement of trained military personnel. Thus the debate remains open, balanced between naturalistic explanations and the possibility of something truly extraordinary. Modern technology has also reshaped how the Belgian wave is studied. High-resolution satellite imagery, digital mapping, and advanced flight tracking systems allow researchers to reconstruct airspace activity in ways that were not possible in 1990. Independent investigators use modern tools to test old claims, overlaying sighting reports with historical flight paths, astronomical data, and weather records. Some anomalies can be resolved with these methods, but many remain stubbornly unexplained. The triangles retain their aura of mystery, even when revisited with 21st-century tools. In Belgium itself, the events continue to attract periodic attention. Documentaries revisit the sightings with fresh interviews, younger researchers dig into the archives, and public lectures draw audiences curious about what really happened in their skies. Local museums and historical societies occasionally host exhibits on the wave, treating it not as fringe curiosity, but as part of the cultural record. The fact that these investigations persist decades later is itself a testament to the enduring impact of the events. Mysteries that are shallow tend to fade quickly. Mysteries with depth live on. Internationally, the wave has become a case study in how societies engage with the unknown. Political scientists and cultural theorists examine how Belgium's openness contrasts with the secrecy of other nations. Science communicators discuss the value of admitting uncertainty, suggesting that the Belgian model might help rebuild public trust in institutions when dealing with difficult or unexplained issues. The debate has therefore expanded far beyond UFOs, touching on larger questions about governance, psychology, and the nature of belief. As for the UFO research community, the Belgian triangles remain a touchstone, a reminder that even in the age of satellites and instant communication, the skies can surprise us. Conferences and journals regularly return to the wave, not only for the details of the sightings, but also for the lessons about methodology, transparency, and public engagement. In a world saturated with information and disinformation alike, the Belgian case stands as a rare example where careful investigation was possible, where data was preserved, and where the story was not immediately drowned in noise. For many witnesses, the debate is less about explanations and more about personal memory. To this day, Belgians who saw the triangles speak with a calm certainty. They may not claim to know what the objects were, but they know what they saw: massive, silent, triangular craft, drifting across the night sky, defying the ordinary. In interviews decades later, the tone is not one of excitement or fear, but of quiet wonder, a desire for resolution, tempered by acceptance that perhaps none will ever come. And so the modern investigation continues, shaped by new tools, fresh perspectives, and global conversations. The triangles over Belgium are no longer just a national mystery, they are a chapter in the wider story of humanity's encounter with the unknown. Whether they were experimental craft, natural misinterpretations, or something beyond our current understanding, their presence still hovers, documented in archives, debated in conferences, and remembered in the minds of those who watched the skies. The ongoing debates, like the triangles themselves, move silently across the landscape of thought, sometimes clear, sometimes elusive, always mysterious. Each new generation of researchers approaches the wave with the same question that haunted Belgium in 1989: what was it that drifted across the skies, so vast and so silent? The fact that we still do not know, after decades of effort, is not a failure of investigation. It is a reminder that mystery remains alive in the modern world, unclaimed, unresolved, and still waiting for those willing to look upward into the night.